To everybody. Good evening and good afternoon for people in the other part of the world. And we are very happy to welcome Monika Ardelt for this seminar about practical wisdom. And I will very briefly introduce Monika, who's a professor of sociology at the University of Florida. And she's a founding faculty member and member of the advisory committee of the University of Florida Center for Spirituality and Health. She is the developer of the very widely and very well-known three-dimensional wisdom scale. And she has, she's published a lot of publications, empirical, theoretical, journal articles and books in several areas connected to wisdom research, especially about the successful human development across life course. And she emphasized particularly the relationship between wisdom, spirituality, aging well and dying well. And these two topics are really impressive. And I'm very, very happy about that because, these are two topics I'm very much involved in. And I think that just studying wisdom and practical wisdom related to them is very valuable. So we are really, really happy to have Monika Ardelt with us. Her talk will be about why and how are wisdom and moral virtues related. So we are very happy to listen to you, and the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Claudia, and thank you so much to Maria Silvia for inviting me to this really exciting webinars. And so as you have heard, I'm a sociologist. I'm not a philosopher, but I'm got introduced to philosophy much later after I already started looking at the relationship between wisdom and aging well and dying well. And so I kind of come to it from the back door in some ways. So so my talk, what I want to do is to give a definition of practical wisdom and moral virtue, start with that, and then provide theoretical reasons for the interconnection between wisdom and moral virtue, which heavily relies on philosophical arguments. And then I will also show that elements of moral virtues are already included in contemporary, often psychological definitions and operationalization of wisdom. I will give you some empirical evidence regarding the correlations between measures of wisdom and moral virtues, and introduce a short-term longitudinal study that attempts to answer the question whether wisdom increases moral virtues increase wisdom, or whether wisdom and moral virtues are reciprocally related. And then finally, I look at the relations between wisdom, moral virtues, and flourishing. So to get started, what are the definitions of practical wisdom, moral virtue? And in this case, later I will tell you about the contemporary, primarily psychological definitions of wisdom. But I want to start with the definition of practical wisdom in the ancient philosophical sense, and particularly Plato's definition in the different kinds of wisdom. So he's distinguishing between episteme, knowledge about the nature of things, and the underlying principles governing their relationship. So which is kind of, you think this is our science, what is going on in the world. And then there is Sophia, obtained through contemplation in pursuit of timeless and universal truths and the ultimate meaning of life. So this is what I see as the mystical part of wisdom. But once we have these kind of, what's happening in life and what's happening maybe beyond the material world, we have to actually live. And this is where phronesis comes in. So practical wisdom that manifests in prudent action, unaffected by the desires of the passions and the deception of the senses. So sometimes when I was reading these accounts of these different definitions of wisdom, they treated it as three different kinds of wisdom. But I see it more as a relationship. So the deep knowledge, self-knowledge, self-insight, and understanding of life gained through episteme and sophia, they need to be applied in daily life through phronesis to lead a good life. And it always comes down to lead a good life. And this is why we get at the very end, we take a look at leading a good life. So what's the definition of moral virtue? And I very heavy rely on Fowers et al. And Sternberg and Glück's definition here. So, so moral virtue is a relatively stable characteristics, meaning it's more trait-like, like a state-like. So it doesn't change from one situation to the other, but it's acquired. It's not inborn. So that means if it's an acquired characteristic, it can be taught, it can be learned, and it manifests in morally motivated moral behavior. So it's related to what people actually do, but it has to be, the behavior has to be morally motivated, basically meaning somebody who acts morally by accident, that's not necessarily moral virtue. So morally motivated moral behavior, such as generosity, kindness, fairness, honesty, courage, loyalty, and justice. And it has to benefit others and the common good. So if it just benefits one person's, let's say, I don't know, I steal something and give it to another person, that definitely benefits another person, but it doesn't benefit the common good. So it has to have these both characteristics. And if it only benefits the common good, you know, let's say state-imposed well-being, but everybody suffers from it, then it's also not moral virtue. So here's the importance of motivation, intention, agency, and habit, you know, to do this on a regular basis. Yet when and how virtues are expressed in an act, it depends on the particular situation. And this is, I think, what Aristotle was saying. You cannot just say, you know, what wise people do, because it always depends on the particular situation. And this is what makes it so tricky. All right, so what are the theoretical reasons for the interconnection between wisdom and moral virtue? And I should say that what I'm presenting today is primarily based on a chapter that I wrote for a forthcoming book edited by Jennifer Frey and I think Nancy Snow. I'm not sure if she's a co-editor or not. But this is the forthcoming edited book on practical wisdom. And I kind of came up with 6 theoretical reasons why the interconnection exists. And I start with Aristotle's this quote: "It is not possible to be good in the strict sense without practical wisdom, nor practically wise without moral virtue," right? So in order to be good, we need wisdom. We need to understand what to do in a certain situation. But in order to be practical wise, there needs to be moral virtue, because otherwise it's not wisdom. So this is our first answer. Wisdom is inherently intertwined with moral virtue, because as a master virtue, wisdom orchestrates the activation and dosage of other virtues to make the right moral decisions in a given context, to live a good life that benefits oneself and others. For the second, I'm referring to Christiansen's, Fowers, Darnell, and Pollard's neo-Aristotelian model of wise, phronetic moral decision-making. Now, this is a relatively complicated model, and they spent a whole article explaining this, so I will not do this justice to just talk about it a couple of minutes. But what you see here is clearly, it's moral identity. It starts with moral identity, and then through moral sensitivity and moral emotions, that leads then to moral decision and moral action. So I try to kind of disentangle this and come up with my second answer. So wisdom requires first a moral foundation, a foundation of morality. Otherwise, nothing will happen. And then moral sensitivity. So the highlighted ones is where wisdom comes in. It's an understanding the ethical aspects of a specific situation and knowing how to respond appropriately. So to know that there is an ethical aspect to a specific situation and then know how to respond. And it also requires moral emotions, that is morally motivated, regulated emotions infused with reason. So I could consider this like empathy, compassion, but infused with reason. Does it make sense, to have these kind of emotions and the absence of harmful emotions, rage, anger, jealousy? Because moral virtues must be valued by a person and be sufficiently developed, morally grounded, so that they can be activated and orchestrated by wisdom in concrete situations to make the morally right decisions and act morally. So with other words, if a person doesn't care about morality and has not developed any moral attitudes, moral sentiments, then there is nothing for wisdom to activate and orchestrate. So the moral foundation is absolutely essential. So for my third answer to the question, I go to Robert Kane's book on ethics and the quest for wisdom. And it's interesting the way he defines wisdom he defines wisdom as being equivalent with living an objectively worthy good life. Basically, what Aristotle was saying, that this is the result of this interconnection between morality and wisdom, is the result is eudaimonia, the living the good life. But in this book, he says, well, how do we know how to live an objectively worthy good life in an area of value relativism? There are many competing ways how to live a life. And so he's basically saying, okay, start the search for what is objectively and universally good and valuable with an openness to others' point of views and ways of life. All right, look at all the possible ways how people can live. And then try it out, experiment with it. By engaging in different ways of living, it's possible to test competing hypotheses about the good life. So these experiments in living, individuals might actually realize that their social role enactments is more likely to result in the good life for themselves and others if their role performance is guided by moral virtues. Now, Kane is a philosopher, but role enactment, social role enactment is, of course, right straight, in the area of sociology. So, for example, right, being a friend, playing the role of a friend or having the role of a daughter or a parent will more likely to result in the good life for myself and others if it's guided by moral virtues, if it is guided by generosity, honesty, cooperation, rather than competition or jealousy or greed or any of this. And therefore, following common moral rules is a condition for aspiring to wisdom in the form of living an objectively worthy good life. We might never actually reach it. We might not ever reach living in an objectively worthy good life, but we can aspire to that. And that leads us to answer number 3. So moral virtues are a precondition for wisdom. It is impossible. So take it, do it the other way around. It is impossible for immoral individuals to live in an objectively worthy good life, which is the ultimate goal of the quest for wisdom in the ancient philosophical sense, this flourishing fulfillment. Then I'm going to looking at Trevor Curno's book on wisdom, intuition, and ethics. Now, as the title says, intuition, he looks actually not from the perspective of someone who starts out on the path toward greater wisdom, but he looks at it from the perspective of someone who is already wise, who has attained wisdom. And he says, for someone who has attained wisdom, wise individuals apply moral virtues intuitively because they have internalized moral values. They can't help it. Moral values are a part of their being, a part of who they are. Otherwise, they wouldn't be wise. So through a higher perception and comprehensive understanding of reality, and motivated by love and compassion, the wise can only act morally. There is no other way, because they wouldn't see any other way, but moral action just doesn't make sense. So therefore, the answer then is answer number 4. After taking the specific circumstances into account, wise persons intuitively make the morally correct decision and engage in the morally right action. And that kind of gets me into the Buddhist view of Buddhist philosophy of the relationship between wisdom and moral values. Because as you see in the Noble Eightfold Path, ethical conduct and wisdom are just integrated. They are part of it. So if we start with ethical conduct, a wise person will engage in right speech, meaning don't lie, don't use words intended to hurt or harm others. Also in right action, don't kill, don't steal, don't engage in sexual misconduct, don't use intoxicants, and in a right livelihood. That means don't engage in any job that violates or encourages others to violate right speech or right action. And this is kind of the foundation that helps to develop right understanding and right thought, the divisions of wisdom, through the divisions of mental discipline, through right effort, right mindfulness, right concentration, basically meditation, really, in the Buddhist philosophy. And that gets us to right understanding, which means the ability to perceive reality as it is, including a deep understanding of the importance of moral virtues for one's own well-being, not just for the well-being of others. Yes, by behaving morally, others will benefit, but I will also benefit if I adhere to moral virtues. And right thought, which is a pure mind that is free of ill will and maliciousness and full of compassion toward all beings, all beings. So this is answer number 5. A moral foundation removes obstacles for the development of wisdom, meaning right understanding and right thought. And then wise understanding in turn. So this is why this is also part of the Eightfold Path, that it all reinforces each other. Wise understanding in turn leads to the insight that moral virtues are not only beneficial for oneself and others to lead a good life, but also free the mind of impurities such as hatred, lust, greed, and self-deception, which can derail right understanding and right thought. So it all hangs together. It's all intertwined. Okay, and then finally, and this is more a kind of conceptual, technical answer, there are elements of moral virtues already embedded in contemporary definitions and operationalizations of wisdom. So that leads us to answer number 6. Well, contemporary definitions and operationalizations of wisdom and moral virtue overlap. This is why they are related. So how is wisdom defined outside of philosophy? And I thank Charles Cassidy here at evidence-based-wisdom.com, who created this nice flyer here, this poster. This is based on a 2009 literature review by Thomas Meeks and Dilip Jester, who looked at 10 major scientific definitions of wisdom and found that there are 6 major components of wisdom: social decision-making, pragmatic knowledge of life, pro-social attitudes and behavior, reflection, self-understanding, uncertainty management, emotional homeostasis, and value relativism and tolerance. And so where are the moral values? Well, they are clearly here in pro-social attitudes and behaviors, but they are also here in value intolerance toward other people's values, to a certain degree, as long as it leads to the good life, and emotional homeostasis, so not getting angry, not losing the balance of one's mind, but developing a compassionate, empathetic mind. And this is a common wisdom model that Igor Grossman and others developed, and I was part of it, a little bit part of it, of this, endeavor here. And what you see is, yes, I mean, the metacognition plays a big role here in wisdom, but there is on one wing of the owl, there are moral aspirations. I was fighting for moral grounding, but anyway, we had moral aspirations, that's okay. So, but that's part of it, it is part of wisdom, common wisdom models, supposedly, basically combining all the existing definitions of wisdom into a one common model. So how are wisdom and moral virtue related in actually empirically? And I want to show you some results of past research findings. But in order to do this, I have to introduce also the different definitions of wisdom, because in the contemporary literature, there's still lots of different definitions of wisdom and how they are actually, how wisdom is operationalized and measured. And I start with the very, this is right at the beginning of wisdom research. The Paul Walters and colleagues, defined wisdom as this combination of these 5 criteria: factual knowledge, strategic knowledge, knowledge about this the context of life, knowledge which considers relativism of values and life goals, knowledge about the fundamental uncertainties of life and ways of life. So basically, what they were saying, it's expert knowledge about the fundamental pragmatics of life. And the way they measure it is participants are asked to discuss ill-defined hypothetical problems in think aloud tasks. Basically, they get a hypothetical problem. Here's an example. 15-year-old girl wants to get married right away. What should one or she consider and do? And then people just talk, right? I mean, think aloud task, without any internal censorship, just talk. And then these answers are transcribed and rated based on these 5 wisdom criteria. Now, as you see, a lot of this is knowledge. I would call this in the cognitive dimension, but there is some, this is the part where moral virtues come in. This is tolerance. Consider the relativism of values and life goals, which is clearly related to tolerance. And then another model is the hero model of wisdom, assessed by the self-assessed wisdom scale developed by Webster. And again, I thank Charles Cassidy for creating this outline here. And this consists of 5 subscale: humor, emotion regulation, reflection, openness to experience, and critical experiences. It's actually critical life experiences. And where moral values are it's in humor, particular use of humor to make others feel comfortable. Clearly, emotion regulation, like composure, temperance, self-control, and all openness that leads to tolerance. And I want to show you, so this is a self-assessed scale, and it's either assessed by 30 item or the newer version at 40 item. And the one in red are kind of related to moral virtue. So in humor, not all of the items in the different subdimensions are related to moral virtues, but some are. Like humor, I can make fun of myself to comfort others. Emotion regulation, I can regulate my emotions when the situation calls for it. It's easy for me to adjust my emotions to the situation at hand. And then openness to experience. I'm very curious about other religions and or other philosophical belief systems. So I want to introduce, starting with some of the correlations between wisdom and indicators of moral virtue. And just comparing the Berlin wisdom paradigm and the 40-item self-assessed wisdom scale, and starting with moral reasoning. And for those of you who are primarily in the field of philosophy, who might not be too familiar with correlations, all you need to know is that correlations vary between -1 and +1, and we are just looking at positive effects here because they are positively related. If one goes up, then the other goes up. And so the closer they are to 1, the stronger is the relationship. So a correlation of 0.29 here, it's pretty moderate. It's okay. It's okay. There's definitely something happening here. And they are all significant. That means they did not just happen by chance. So well-being of friends, they are positively correlated, social engagement and ecological protection. But you also see that the self-assessed wisdom scale has higher correlation than the Berlin wisdom paradigm with most of these indicators of moral virtue. Maybe because some people would argue because they are both scales based on self-reported scales, or because the self-assessed wisdom scale has indeed more overlap with moral virtue. Wink and Dillon measured personal wisdom through California Q-sort ratings, which were basically 100 cards that are sorted in some ways. And then they chose 13 items, and some of these items, like philosophically concerned, is related, I would argue, is related to moral virtue. They Wink and Helsen also measured what they called practical wisdom, and they used 18 cognitive, reflective, and mature self-descriptive adjectives from the adjective checklist. And so of the 14 adjectives that are indicative of wisdom, there is clearly what would be related to moral virtues is fair-mindedness, thoughtful, tolerant, understanding, mature, and then the absence of being immature, intolerant, and reckless. And they also measure transcendent wisdom. And the way they did this, they asked participants to write down their descriptions of their own wisdom and how it developed over time. And then they rated these answers based on these 5 criteria. And self-transcendence and concern with philosophical and spiritual issues, I would say, have overlap with moral virtues. So if we look at those variables, there is the Q-sort and the self-assessed wisdom scale were relatively strongly related to generativity. Generativity basically means being concerned about the next generation, not just your own, children or grandchildren, but the next generation. So through mentoring or through helping them to succeed in some way. And then benevolence, this was a combination of practical wisdom, and the transcendent wisdom rating was also correlated with wisdom in a moderate range. So this is the model that I developed, three-dimensional wisdom model. It is based not on philosophy, but it's based on research by Clayton and Biren. Really, I think it was Vivian Clayton's dissertation research. And she asked people, middle-aged, younger people, older people, what they thought characteristics of wisdom were, and then gave these characteristics of wisdom to another group of middle-aged, older, younger people. And they basically said, how much, and they were just asked, how much is this characteristic part of wisdom? And then they used these results in a multidimensional scaling analysis, and they came up with these three dimensions, the cognitive, reflective, and they called it the affective dimension. And I renamed it now the compassionate dimension, because it's not just any emotions, it's actually compassionate emotions. And I just thought this makes so much sense to me, that wisdom consists of these three dimensions. So I kind of adopted this model and I developed it further. And so I define it in these three ways: cognitive dimension, ability to perceive reality as it is, and understand reality deeply, particularly the intrapersonal and interpersonal aspects of life, understanding the deeper meaning of life. And to get to this cognitive dimension, we need the reflective dimension, which is kind of related to Sophia, in terms of contemplation, but also the ability to look at phenomena and events from different angles, including oneself, self-reflection, self-examination. And by doing this, ego dissolves or is reduced, self-centeredness is reduced, and one gets better understanding not only of life, but also of other people, which then should lead to the compassionate dimension, which is defined as sympathetic and compassionate love for others. And that is the part that's related to moral values. And the way I measure this, I measure it through 39 items, and where there's overlap with moral virtues is clearly in the compassionate dimension, positive, caring, and nurturing emotions and behavior toward others, and the absence of indifferent or negative emotions and behavior toward others. But it's also a little bit in the reflective dimension, particularly in the sub-dimension of absence of subjectivity and projections. Then there is wisdom as self-transcendence, and this was developed by Levinson and al. Based on Kurnoff's explicit wisdom theory. So self-transcendence develops in several steps. It starts with self-knowledge, who am I? Who am I? And realizing that I'm consisting of many different roles, social roles. And at the next stage, there is some detachment, awareness of the changing nature of everything, including the social roles. The role of the daughter, of the parent changes over time. Some roles are discarded, new roles are taken on, and so on. So everything is changing. At the next stage, there is an integration and dissolution of separate inner selves, and an integration into one overall self, including the shadow side of oneself, the negative aspects on oneself, accepting the negative aspects with the positive aspect, and accepting the whole of the self. But then at the last stage, there's self-transcendence. That's the dissolution of rigid boundaries between self and others, the understanding that we are connected to everything else. And that's the part that overlaps with moral virtues, because If I know that I'm connected to everything else, then if I hurt others, I really do hurt myself. And this scale is measured. There are different versions, 14-item or 25-item versions of the adult self-transcendence inventory, ASTI. And not all of the items would have an overlap with moral virtues, but some do. For example, I feel more compassionate even toward people who have been unkind to me. So respondents are asked whether their view of life is different today than it was 10 years ago, and says, yes, I feel more compassionate even toward people who have been unkind to me. But there is also an ASTI where you can just ask about the current situation. Then this is a relatively newer scale, the San Diego Wisdom Scale, based on these 6 components of wisdom. Thomas, Jester, were trying to come up with a measure that covers all these components of wisdom. It has 24 items and 6 subscales. And as before, the pro-social behavior would be overlapping with moral virtues, tolerance for divergent values, and emotional regulation. And here are some example items. And then we have the practical wisdom scale. This is a little bit different, the scale, because it has 7 items and it asks respondents not about themselves, but how strongly they agree with statements that describe characteristics of wisdom or being wise. Is this a characteristic of wisdom and being wise? And then they say, if they say yes to these things, then if they more agree with this, Krause argues that also shows that these people are wiser. I would say not necessarily, but anyway, this is how he has defined it. And there's 3 dimension, cognitive, reflective, like in my model, and then pro-social domain. So it's kind of similar to my model, but it's measured in a different way. So, over the years, I found that learning when to forgive is an important part of being wise. My argument is, yes, I have learned that too. It's still hard, right? I'm not sure if I still can do it. So therefore, there might be a difference, only that I say, yeah, I think that's what a wise person does, doesn't mean that I'm wise. Anyway, if we do look at these correlations now and their, empathy, a lot of these wisdom scales are correlated with empathy, but not the Berlin wisdom paradigm, which I thought was interesting. Remember, Berlin wisdom paradigm is more cognitively oriented, a lot of knowledge, and it wasn't correlated with empathy. But emotional competence related to other, yes, all of these scales are, again, lower for the Berlin wisdom paradigm. Humility was only measured for the, at least at this time, was only measured for the practical wisdom scale, and then the SDYs and the self-assessed wisdom scale and the 3-dimensional wisdom scale with forgiveness. And that is relatively strong correlation as correlations go. And then there is an extra study, recent study with the 3DYs that also looked at moral intelligence, compassion, honesty, and responsibility, and they all moderate to strongly correlated with these aspects of moral virtue. Okay, so we know that there is a correlation, right, between indicators of moral virtue and different measures of wisdom. But what is the direction of the association between wisdom and moral virtue? Does it mean that wisdom increases moral virtue, or is it the other way around? And I want to thank Jarvis Kingsbury, my former student, who actually collected the data that I'm using here. So with the hypothesis, I would say definitely, wisdom is positively correlated with moral virtue because we saw it in past studies and it will be here as well. But I would also argue that wisdom fosters moral virtue because wise individuals, as we saw in the theoretical part, are likely to behave morally because they comprehend the true meaning of the golden rule. Because if I treat others badly, I actually hurt myself. But then also moral virtue are likely to promote growth in wisdom because they provide this moral foundation for the development of wisdom and therefore make it easier to grow in wisdom due to less self-centeredness and greater empathy and concern for others. So very briefly, the data come from 230 undergraduate students in the social sciences that were surveyed at the beginning and the end of the fall semester in 2016. Mean age was 21 years, median age 20 years. And 2/3 were women and about half were white and the other half non-white. And then, for wisdom, we used the 3-dimensional wisdom scale. And for indicators of moral virtue, we used gratitude. Gratitude, the McCullough 6-item gratitude questionnaire. And the Hexaco PIR measuring sincerity, fairness, and modesty. And they all measured on a 5-point scale from strongly disagree to strongly agree, except for the gratitude that has strongly disagree and strongly agree on a 1 to 7 scale. For control variables, we used year in college, gender, race, and socioeconomic status of parents. And year in college was highly correlated with age, so therefore age is not included. Okay, what did we find? Well, first of all, if you just look at the correlations between wisdom and indicators of moral virtue, I should tell you, don't get scared by this table, but this quadrant here shows the correlations at time 1. This shows the correlation at time 2, and this shows the correlation across time. So if you look at time 1, yes, wisdom, this is number 1, is correlated with gratitude, sincerity, fairness, and modesty at time 1. And it's also correlated at time 2, and actually a little bit stronger at time 2 than it was at time 1. But then if you look across time, wisdom at time 1, at the beginning of the semester, was also correlated with gratitude, sincerity, fairness, and modesty at time 2, at the end of the semester, but also reversely, that gratitude, sincerity, fairness at time 1 was correlated with wisdom at time 2. So to really figure out which affects which, what we have to do is to control for baseline scores. And we do this through cross-legged autoregressive models to examine relations between time 1 and time 2, wisdom and moral virtue, or measures after controlling for baseline scores. And I just tell you a little bit how this goes with the first one, and then we go a little bit faster. So the first thing what we do here in these models is we control for the baseline scores, take this out and then see what the remaining effects are. And we see here, and just look at the second number here, because these are the standardized effect. These are the standardized effect, meaning they actually vary from -1 to +1, and the unstandardized don't. So again, the closer they are to 1, the stronger it is. And that means, a wisdom standardized effect from wisdom on time 1 to time 2 of 0.76, that's pretty stable. And that's actually what you want, right? You want that wisdom is relatively stable across the semester, because you would think that it's more trait-like rather than state-like. Now, gratitude is also stable, but not as stable as wisdom. And that means there is a little bit more variation to explain at the end rather than in wisdom. And as before, this is just as before, they are correlated at the beginning of the semester, but wisdom at time 1 does have a positive effect. And now because we're controlling for baseline score, that means it has a positive effect on positive changes in gratitude at time 2. But it's also true that gratitude at time 1 has a positive effect on positive changes in wisdom at time 2. So this is really a reciprocal relationship between wisdom and gratitude. And even after controlling for all these effects, wisdom and gratitude at time 2 are still correlated contemporarily. So we do this with all the other moral virtues as well. So first, controlling for the baseline scores, And then looking at, yes, wisdom at time 1 is positively correlated with positive changes in sincerity at time 2. And sincerity at time 1 is not positively correlated with changes in wisdom at time 2. So here we only have wisdom affects sincerity, but contemporarily there's still a significant correlation between those two measures. And fairness, again, wisdom at time 1, positive related to fairness, at positive related to positive changes in fairness at time 2. But fairness as time 1, not related to positive changes in wisdom at time 2. But again, concurrently correlated at time 2 as well. But then modesty, wisdom at time 1 is not correlated with positive changes with modesty at time 2, but modesty at time 1 is positively correlated to positive changes in wisdom at time 2. And again, they are positively correlated contemporarily at the end of the semester. All right. But now, how about flourishing? You know, we know, I mean, Aristotle is saying it, a lot of people saying it, that wisdom should orchestrate the moral virtues and then lead to flourishing. Okay, let's take a look at that. Wisdom and the good life. According to Aristotle, life grounded in moral virtues that are orchestrated by phronesis results in eudaimonia, which has been translated as a life of fulfillment, flourishing, psychological well-being, and enduring joy. So hypothesis 4 is now wisdom orchestrates moral virtues and results in flourishing. And I'm assessing it by sense of mastery and purpose in life, self-acceptance, and an orientation toward personal growth. Basically, this is based on Carol Riff's theory of psychological well-being, and she has like 6 indicators of psychological well-being that she translates also as flourishing, eudaimonia, and don't use positive relation with others and autonomy. So they are not included, but they were not measured. So mastery is measured by Perling and Schoolers, mastery scale, purpose in life by 3 pure meaning items from Kronberg's and Holig's purpose in life test, and then using the Riff scales for self-acceptance and orientation toward personal growth. And so how does it look like? Well, first of all, wisdom at the beginning of the semester does indeed orchestrate these 4 indicators of moral virtue: sincerity, modesty, fairness, gratitude. It's all related to this. And then wisdom at term 1 is positively related to flourishing at time 2, as this is a latent variable, and the indicators are mastery, self-acceptance, purpose in life, and personal growth. So, and because the factor loadings are relatively high, so they can be considered good indicators of this latent variable. And among the moral virtues, it's only gratitude that is also positively related to flourishing after you control for wisdom. So yeah, it seems to be true that wisdom does lead to flourishing. So what are the summary of the research findings? First, we had our first hypothesis: wisdom is positively correlated with moral virtue, and yep, that was supported even after controlling for the baseline variables. Hypothesis 2, wisdom fosters moral virtue. That was also supported for gratitude, sincerity, and fairness. And then hypothesis 3, moral virtue promotes growth in wisdom. That was supported for gratitude and modesty. And it's interesting that I think gratitude and modesty are the 2 moral virtues that are related kind of to a reduction or a lower self-centeredness. And so maybe that's what it's necessary for wisdom to grow. And then the 4th hypothesis, wisdom orchestrates moral virtues and results in flourishing. Yep, that was also supported. So in conclusion, It appears that wisdom and moral virtue are reciprocally related. Encouraging the development of moral virtue will benefit growth in wisdom, and conversely, greater wisdom fosters moral virtue and human flourishing. So I think Aristotle was right. It's not possible to be good in the strict sense without practical wisdom, nor practically wise without moral virtue. Thank you for listening, and I'm looking forward to your questions and comments.
Thank you so much, Monika. It was really terrific.
Thank you.
Being a philosopher, I was really impressed and amazed by this very nice and clear and complete, picture of the scales, of the measurement instruments, and I really appreciated the way you derived and demonstrated these 4 hypotheses, because I think it's really, really valuable and important in wisdom studies. So now I think that it's time for questions. We have basically half an hour. So if you want to raise your hand, I will open the discussion. I'm opening the discussion. Okay, so we have one question. Okay, so let's start with Nick.
Hi, thank you for your talk. Very interesting stuff. And thanks for all the data, especially something I crave as someone in philosophy. So one thing I found myself wondering is what you would expect to find if you were also using behavioral measures of cognition or thinking dispositions. Like if you think it would basically look very similar, or if you think there might be a slight distinction between the way people think of themselves cognitively and maybe the way they perform cognitively.
Well, that's always a problem, right? I mean, because how do you measure it? And the behavior is really tricky, because you don't know why they behave this way, because what matters is really intention, right? It's intention, because people might behave exactly in the same way, and one has this moral motivation as foundation, and another person might not, might do it to impress others, right? Or to fool others even, right? And therefore behavior, I think, is tricky. In the end, yes, behavior of course matters, right? It does matter, behavior, but to assess it empirically, and I'm kind of in the business of trying to measure things, it's so tricky, because it depends on the intention, and it's really difficult to do that, So in some ways, what you can do is to combine these, and that's what we have trying to do, which is still not perfect, but it's maybe a step in the right direction, to combine the self-assessed scale measures. And by the way, people are not told that these are wisdom scales, right? Because if they, and this is another problem with the Krause scale, because, you tell them, it's like, yeah, of course, you have this social desirability bias. So they're not told these are wisdom scales, not just, well, general attitudes and behavior, whatever, right? But there is still this danger of socially desirable responding. And so it's a good idea to kind of pair this with interviews, qualitative interviews, for example. And then you can go a little bit deeper, and you can ask, well, under which condition, what did you do and why did you do it? You might be able to ask. Of course, ideally, what you should do is to do ethnographic field work, and follow people around, right? And see what they actually do. And then you can ask them in this situation, why did you do this, right? But that's hard, to do. I know Judith Glück had, at one point, she actually employed a student from anthropology and had her follow shadow people that they thought were their wisest exemplars. And I don't think they have published it, but they presented it at a conference, and I thought it was really fascinating, that they did behave wisely. But yes, I mean, Nick, that's exactly the problem. You know, how do you assess it? You know?
Thanks.
Mhm.
Good. So now we have another question. Maria Silvia.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks so much, Monica. That was really illuminating. And as a philosopher, I share the gratitude expressed by both Claudia and Nick for all these data, which are really, really, really useful and difficult to navigate for us sometimes. Maybe a really naive question. It seems to me that all the paradigms you've presented, the paradigms of wisdom, well, conceive of wisdom as something which is in itself, let's say, amoral or non-strictly moral, and then which has something of a moral component or needs a moral foundation or orientation. That, of course, needs to be provided by something outside or different from wisdom itself. So that struck me as something I wouldn't expect, because I mean, I tend to think of practical wisdom as itself something like an intrinsically moral disposition or virtue, even though it comprises of cognitive, intuitive, or other aspects. So, I mean, I'm not surprised that it correlates with the moral virtues, so to speak, because I think it's itself embodies a moral orientation. So maybe the question is, why do most scholars conceive of wisdom as non-strictly moral and in need of a moral foundation outside itself? And what you think about that?
No, I actually agree with you completely that it's part of it already. That's what I was in, you know, answer number 6 actually shows that there is overlap in the operationalizations and definitions of wisdom with moral virtue. We don't necessarily call it moral virtue, but there's clearly overlap, right? I mean, the compassionate component in the 3-dimensional wisdom model, it's part with the pro-social behavior. You know, it's based on the separation comes from that we really didn't think about it to really name it, right? I mean, because we come from the social sciences, and so it's inherent in some ways, but it is not. It's not in the measurement explicitly. And then now the question when this came up, right? It became an interesting empirical question. Well, if it is, then it should be related to these moral virtue. So I don't disagree with you at all. But I know the way you define things, I'm just saying we're coming from a kind of a thinking. What I think what you why do we need to that there is a moral foundation? I mean, is it not in wisdom? And I would say yes, it is. But for me, it is. For me, it very much is. People come from that perspective. And I kind of had to fight in this common wisdom model to get my moral, I wanted to have the moral grounding in there, you know, and I got moral aspirations, you know, because for me, it is a part of this, right? But for other people, you see the Berlin wisdom model, which is really one of the first ones in the psychology. It comes from the cognitive aspect. It comes from this, you know, it comes from the research on intelligence, and then Piaget, post-conventional thinking. Yeah, you know, what's the next stage after, you know, post-formal thinking, after formal thinking, beyond, right? So this comes all. The tradition is cognitive big thing, it wasn't a big centrality of this. I have a different perspective. I come from this more, like, as I say, Clayton and Biren, and if you ask lay people or, regular people, what do you think wisdom is? Morality is a part of this, right? Definitely. For them, it's always a part of it. And you also see when from the Buddhist philosophy, it's integrated. They are part of it. So from my perspective, it is integrated. It's part of it. But then from an empirical point of view, you still want to see, is it correlated with these different aspects of moral virtues? Because they should be highly correlated with this. But at the same time, I don't want to put it all in, because the wisdom concept is already loaded. A lot of people say, well, why isn't mastery in there? Why isn't purpose in there? Why isn't coping in there? You can blow it up and make it bigger and bigger. And so for me, the essential elements is this cognitive, reflective, and compassionate component. And I think it's relatively parsimonious, but they're all required, all in combination. There is not a cognitive wisdom and a reflective wisdom. Sometimes people say this and say, no. There's a cognitive dimension of wisdom, but all of these are required. And for me, the reflective and the compassionate components are what makes this moral foundation, where you find the moral foundation. So I'm not sure if I answered this correctly, but it's sufficiently, but that's how I see it.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. That's very useful.
Thank you. Now we have Fabio Vigilio.
Good evening. I apologize in advance for my bad English. And thank you,
okay.
thank you very much for the presentation. It has enriched my knowledge on the subject a lot. I was wondering if the pursuit of wisdom, admitting is a relationship with moral virtues, there isn't the risk of a dogmatic edification of some values in the pursuit of wisdom. That is, aspiring to wisdom could not also mean that we must always be ready to question and criticize moral values. Can we say that wisdom is also openness to accepting that accepting new perspective and reevaluating the vision of the world we have?
Well, it depends. It depends how you define moral virtues, right? That's why I kind of like this definition by Fowers and Sternberg and Gluck, what it is, so in the end, you have this, so that's habit, intention, and it has to benefit others and the common good. And I think if this is a basis, has to benefit others and the common good. So you could say, morality, things are changing, moral values are changing. Does it benefit others and the common good, or does it hurt others and the common good? And, and that could be the yardstick to say, yes, that is acceptable, right? So for example, same-sex marriage, as an example, does it benefit others and the common good? Does it hurt others or the common good? I don't see how it hurts others or the common good. If, people get married of the same sex, does it hurt you? Oh, it hurts my, moral sensibility. Yeah, but does it hurt you personally, right? No, it doesn't, right? Does it benefit the common good? Actually, it does, because now you have parents that are married, right? That have children, and then you have, for all kinds of institutional reasons, being married provides some stability. So it does benefit the common good. So we would say, yes, that's good, right? So I think if you use this kind of yardstick, so you can judge if, the values are changing, moral values are changing, does it can you accept it as a moral value, or would you have to reject it in some ways? You know, that would be my answer to this.
Okay, clear. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
If there are any more questions up to now, I would like to ask my own, which is just a comment. I noticed that in your three-dimensional wisdom scale, I really like the idea you divided the three parts or dimensions of wisdom, and specifically the compassionate dimension really interested me, because I'm getting acquainted and revising some perspectives about the centrality of virtues, and specifically the possibility that there is a central virtue or a core virtue which is supposed to have a special role or a special, I would say, original feature influencing or generating or, you know, instantiating different virtues. As a prototypical example of what being virtuous means. And most authors tend to devote their attention either to wisdom, specifically practical wisdom, or to care. So in your account, I understood, if I understood right, that the compassionate dimension is a way of saying that care is part of practical wisdom, and specifically, probably, I don't know if I understood right, as you can confirm or disconfirm, derive from it. So working on practical wisdom generates also care, which is not outside practical wisdom and cannot be sought by itself. Is that right, or should you?
Yes, that is right. And this is exactly what the controversy is, you know, where I have been fighting kind of, you know, the battle, you know, is it part of wisdom or not, right? And as I said, traditionally, a lot of the wisdom research, actually there were two strands. One is Clayton and Biren, you know, started in the late 1970s. And this paper that I'm citing all the time is where the model comes from. It's from 1980. And at the same time was the Baltus group, who had developed the Berlin wisdom paradigm, which started kind of, I mean, they said they started in the 80s, but it was more later 80s, 90s. Okay, so these were the prevailing paradigm. And the Baltus group would say, even so they define it, the moral values in their theoretical definition, morality is there, but in their measure it isn't. It's not there. You know, as I say, you know, you can maybe tolerance is somewhere there, you know, but it doesn't have a very prominent place. And then others also, you know, like Igor Grossman's with the wise reasoning, it's more the cognitive component, you know, where the cognitive component, reflection is there, definitely. The cognitive component is there, but the compassionate part is not. The care, and absolutely care, compassionate, I would say this is equivalent. And so that's why I have been fighting for this part, because my argument is that if you only have the cognitive and the reflective, you have all the knowledge, you have all the insight, right? But what you could do with this insight is basically manipulate other people, you know, for your own benefit, you know, the psychopaths, for example, you know, the sociopath. You know, to really use this insight, this deeper insight, knowing, understanding other people, but then using it to manipulate them in some ways for your own benefit. And that's not wisdom. You know, that's not what we would call a wise person. So therefore, I would say that this compassionate, caring component is an essential part of wisdom. Without it, it shouldn't be called wisdom. You know, it should be, yes, call it, you know, post-formal thinking or whatever, but it isn't wisdom. This is a very essential part, this caring for other people, having this compassionate and sympathetic love for other people, not just people, actually beings, for other beings, right? Without it, it's not wisdom, but again, I've been fighting this battle, and so therefore with the common wisdom model, where it is moral aspiration, I said, no, it needs to be moral grounding. It needs to be grounded, because for a truly wise person, it's grounded in morality. It's not just aspiring to be moral. This is the Kurnow model, where it's once wisdom is reached, which clearly most of us have not reached it. But if you really think of a highly wise person, they can't help it but be moral, behave morally. And so therefore, I think there is this intertwining. Absolutely.
Since there aren't any other questions, I would like to reply very, very quickly and ask you a little something else. What do you think about the opposite perspective? Or let's say, what if we see the other way around? So what would you answer to people saying, well, if this were true, then you don't even need practical wisdom, you just need care. What else?
Yeah.
So what would you answer to this,
Well, care can go awry here, I would say, if you don't have wisdom, if you don't have the other components, if you don't have the understanding, the reflection, then people might, I gave the example of, the New Age movement, that they might have a lot of care, maybe also reflection and things, but if the cognitive component is missing, they might believe in strange theories, that might have no foundation in reality. So that's why I think care does need this cognitive grounding of reality, of the cognitive component and of the reflection, because otherwise, well, it can lead to being exploited by other people, that they see, oh, this is a caring person, and they will exploit them, or you provide care for causes that might not be the most beneficial. I think it needs to have the balance of the other ones. What is the example that somebody gave? Giving drugs to an addict out of care is not really helping. And the addict really wants the drugs, right? And it's really desperate. And you're a caring person, you want to relieve the suffering, but no, giving drugs to the addict is not the right thing to do. So therefore, you need the reflection and the cognitive to know what Aristotle was saying, to basically to do this orchestration, to know what to do in this particular circumstances, with the particular people involved, to do the right thing.
Thank you very much, Monika. Yeah, I agree with you. I think that despite maybe the appearance, yeah, I think it's true that benevolence or care are not self-sufficient, although one might think that they are, benevolence and care, already set in a balanced way. But yeah, I think that this is a little too much. It's a little too probably naive and too maybe idealistic. Oh, there's another question. Maybe it's the last one. Let's see. Oh, it's another question of, no, I have two questions. I hope that we have time. I think that the first to raise the hand was Maria Silvia and then Angelo, but maybe Angelo, because he hasn't asked any questions yet. So I would give
It was just a follow-up, but I can wait.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Oh, first, Maria Silvia. Well, two short questions. One, the first is when you speak about modesty, no, do you speak also about humility? Modesty is more or less humility, because I think so, but maybe you think, why do you use the word modesty? This is the first question. But the other question, there is the place in your questions to people about the topic of the search for truth. Do you know, for instance, or the loyalty to truth? Do you know? Because there is also, of course, this is a top truth. What I think it is true. Well, this one is reality, perhaps. What you say, reality, but I don't know.
Well, yes. Okay, let me answer the first one first, because it's easy to answer. The reason why I call it modesty is basically because it comes. Yes, it's basically humility. You're right. You know, there are humility scales. I could have used that, you know, but it just comes from the scale. So really to understand it, an experimental truth based on own experiences rather than, you know, scientific knowledge. It's not scientific knowledge, but it's this deep understanding of life based on own experiences. And so, but will we ever get the truth? That's a completely different question, right? It's just the search for truth, this, you know, getting in this movement towards truth, definitely. I mean, I would definitely say we might never ever get this unless, you know, maybe the Buddha being enlightened, you know, I don't know, you know, but for most of us, we will never get to that, but we can get probably closer to the truth or more far away from it, you know. And I think that's what a wise person is trying to do. It's getting closer to the truth.
Thanks. Many thanks.
Monica, Maria Silvia.
Yeah, sorry, but I couldn't refrain by asking the opposite question of Claudia's. I might sound like a broken record for those who know me, but I have more or less always the same question. But I'm very happy to know what you think, because Claudia said, once you have care, why should you need practical wisdom? Well, my question would be, once you have practical wisdom, if you conceive practical wisdom as comprising of all these elements, including emotional, goal, orientational, let's say, elements, why should you need the virtues? In other words, why should you need to separate the two constructs rather than just saying, well, the overlap is so huge that you can simply say that virtuousness is being wise, and that you have different names for the different virtues for the sake of clarity, of explanation, of, I don't know, post hoc justification of what you did. But in the end, what you have it is this integration of moral, cognitive aspects, which is wisdom. That would be, I mean, my intuition about wisdom, but I don't know what you think.
I agree with you that I think that, and I agree with Kurno in this regard, you know, that a wise person, a really truly wise person, is also, you know, is also the moral person. You know, there is no distinction anymore. You know, it's really the same. However, who among us is truly wise, right? And so on the path toward wisdom, you know, I think you need kind of both, you know. And so in this regard, I think you need this moral foundation to get even started. Because if somebody is not interested in morality, who says, I'm perfectly happy to live an immoral life, to get whatever I can get for myself, and who cares about other people, right? And, to steal, to lie, to cheat, whatever, it's good for me, who cares about others? This person cannot develop any wisdom. I think this would be impossible. So therefore, I think it makes sense to have this as a kind of separate, concept, still talking about it, but and then let's do the other way around. Somebody who is completely moral, are they automatically wise? Not so sure if this is true either, because you can imagine that somebody is, follows the, 10 commandments, 5 precepts of the Buddhas, and all of this, but is not interested in a deeper truth about life, what's really going on. And I wouldn't say, no, they are very moral, that's great, it's good, right? But I wouldn't call them wise. So therefore, for these reasons, right, I would say we needed both. But the truly wise person is both. There is no question about it. There is where it comes together. But on the way toward wisdom, I think, you need these two parts, that kind of reinforce each other and help each other. And then they come together for the truly wise person.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
So thank you again, Monika. Thank you for being so passionate about the topic.
Yeah, well, that's what I do. I do study wisdom, and I love it. I love it. Yeah.
Yes, we too. That's why we really enjoyed so much this talking with you, and enlarging our perspectives with your help. So thanks again. I think that we reached the time to say goodbye, and to thank again our guests, and we will see each other in our seminar series next year, because our next talk will be in January, the 13th of January, and we will have Polina Sliva as our guest in the next talk about practical wisdom and expertise. So I thank again Monika in the first place, and all the the participants to this seminar, and bye-bye. See you next time to all of you.
And
thanks again.
Thank you for your questions and comments. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye, everybody.
Bye.